Now, in the previous part of our discussion of the Declaration of Independence, we left off with this notion of consent of the governed. And again, just to recap, what does this mean? It means that contrary to monarchical systems, whereby a king, a queen, even an emperor system, right? Well, they rule with absolute authority, and there is no consent given by the people, actual approval or permission, right? Given by the ruled, or as Jefferson calls it, the governed, right? But in this case, in a modern government, well, you have consent given. And that means, of course, that the ruled aren't just these simple people who passively accept the authority of rulers. No, this is different. In the modern world, in a modern government, those rulers who are in those positions, they are appointed, right? They receive permission to be the rulers of the ruled, to be the governors of the governed. And of course, in our system today, that's by a vote, right? Election. Now, going back to the function of government, let's remember here that Jefferson had previously stated governments are instituted by the people to secure the rights of life and liberty and pursuit of happiness. But then, just a few sentences down, or a few phrases down, he goes on to say, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem likely, most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So what he's saying there is, should this government, who had been given consent to rule over the ruled, if that government fails to secure, to protect these liberties, if the liberties are violated by that government, well, it's the right of the people to change that government, okay? That is to say, to kick him out of power, basically, and put in a new government, as he says here, that will indeed protect and secure life, liberty, and happiness. All right, so notice here, and this is important to note, it is a set of mutual obligations here, right? It's mutually understood here that there are obligations on both sides, like a contract. The ruled agree, or they give their consent to the rulers, the governors, right, legislators, presidents, what have you today, to rule over them, to govern them. They give them the authority to do so, to exercise that power, with the expectation that those leaders or rulers will secure life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, so again, a set of obligations. So moving on with the text in the Declaration, Jefferson says, prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. Meaning, you can't just replace government just because you feel like it, right? In fact, Jefferson goes on to argue that when there is no government, mankind, as he said, are more disposed to suffer. So therefore, you just can't get rid of government willy-nilly, so to speak. So the question is, when can you get rid of the government and replace them with just rulers? Here is where he places that argument. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, in fact, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. So this sentence is basically saying you have to have, this occurrence of abuse and taking away of rights, usurpations, to use this term. And indeed, when you have a history of that, what he calls a long train, well, what's happening is a form of despotism. And what is despotism? It really means rule by a single authority, that it's typically tyrannical, right? They're tyrants. They rule unjustly, and they cause harm to the ruled. So if this state of affairs is actually in place, Jefferson says, it's their right to throw off such government and provide new guards for their security. And then he points the accusatory finger at, King George. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all of which having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. Okay, so these are key terms here: tyranny and despotism, right? Closely connected in terms of, basic definition. Again, tyranny is unjust rule, absolute rule, where the ruler has no concern with the welfare, the well-being of the ruled. All right. So again, let me repeat the fact that he's putting forth facts as evidence, right? And this is a long list, right? This is a long train of abuse, to use his own term. And some of this evidence, so to speak, we are familiar with in our discussion, such as here, he has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislators. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to civil power, quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, protecting them by mock trial. Okay, remember the Murder Act? That was part of the Coercive Act, where a royal official cannot be put in trial in the colonies. They have to be tried in England. Cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. That's the Prohibitory Acts. Notice this, however, that taxes are in the middle, if not near to the end of this list. And let's remember also that at bottom, this issue was economic. It was about what the colonials felt was unfair taxes. And indeed, up to this point, until military conflict, you could define this struggle and this conflict as a tax revolt, right? Okay, so again, this is a long list here that he's giving us, providing evidence. So therefore, the conclusion of this argument, because it's important to note this, the Declaration of Independence is indeed an argument, right, as to why the colonies should sever that umbilical relation with the mother country, right? And it's because of tyranny and despotism leveled against the colonies, and the evidence is provided with the long list, and therefore you declare your independence from the mother country, and in the process, in that very act, you form a sovereign country that is now known as the United States of America. Now, here is a very important term to take note of. What is happening in the body of the Declaration of Independence is that it's reflecting something called social contract theory. Okay, social contract theory, which in political philosophy was a major innovation during the Enlightenment period. And you could think of philosophers like John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. Anyway, social contract theory, in this context at least, it's very complicated, but in this specific context, social contract theory applies like this. In this new relationship between, again, the ruler and the ruled, it is the ruled who gives the power and authority to the ruler to rule, as we discussed. The ruled are giving them consent, right, to use that phrase. However, it's like a contract. And here's where freedom comes in. When you think about the idea of contract, you're thinking about free will. Whenever you sign a contract, in other words, whether it's today or back then, there's this assumption involved that you are entering in this agreement according to your own free will. There's no coercion, right? No one's putting a gun to your head to sign a contract, right? All parties involved are presumably free to do so. So too with social contract, right, between the ruler and the ruled. There are mutual obligations that are agreed upon. And what are the obligations in this specific case again? And just to repeat numerous times here, right, the ruled grant their consent to those chosen in positions of rulership. They allow them to exercise their power over the governed or the ruled. But the rulers, have to rule in a way that protects their rights and freedoms. And again, it's all stated in this document. And again, this is life, liberty, and happiness. That's admittedly vague. How could we concretize this? Well, as the Constitution would unfold some years later, think about the Bill of Rights, right? The first 10 amendments, First Amendment, Second Amendment, Third Amendment, and going forward. Right? So should the government fail to honor those rights or grant them, this is, to use, the language of contract, this is a breach of contract. And therefore, that's a violation of the terms of agreement. And therefore, that ruler, their power has been, made void. It's null and void, this contract made, right? And the ruled have a right to take away their power and find another government that will do so. In other words, different representatives in our democracy. So that's social contract theory in this specific circumstance relating to the colonial crisis leading to the American Revolution. Now, after July 4th, 1776, this means that the newly formed United States of America is at war with the most powerful empire in the world, the most powerful navy, a very powerful professional army. The newly formed United States, on the other hand, had nothing even close. No navy. They had, militias, but that's about it. They had to organize an army. And think about this also. This rebellion, right, if it was indeed squashed by the powerful British Empire, what would happen to the leaders of this revolt? Leaders like Jefferson and Washington and John Adams and John Dickinson, and indeed the entire vanguard of colonial leadership. Well, as with most rebellions against the king or emperor in history up to that point, they would be summarily executed, right? They would be hanged for acts of treason against the king. So indeed, this is an act of courage here. Now, lack of time prevents a discussion of the military history of the American Revolutionary War. For that, please resort to your textbook. But there are several reasons why the United States actually won this war. Number one, they're fighting not to win, but not to lose, okay? And that's very important to recognize. They did not have to defeat the English Empire. They just didn't have to succumb to it, right? And hope that the English Empire just gave up. Number two is the vast distance, across the ocean to wage this war from the English Parliament's point of view, or the English government's point of view. And number three is the assistance of the French Empire eventually on behalf of the United States of America. They stepped in at a crucial moment and helped steer the war in favor of the United States.